Welcome. I'm Latanya Jones of the Department of Records and Information Services. We're home to the city's Municipal Archives and Library. I am happy to welcome our host today, Dr. Andrea Mosterman. She's an associate professor in Atlantic History and Joseph Triegel Endowed Professor of Early American History at the University of New Orleans and researches slavery in the Dutch Atlantic world. Faces of Enslavement, A History of Slavery and Resistance in Dutch New York, won the 2020 Hendricks Award for Best Book-Length Manuscript Relating to New Netherlands and the Dutch Colonial Experience. Without further ado, Dr. Mosterman.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to share my research with all of you. Thank you for whoever's joining during your lunch hour. Wish I could see you, but it's good to have you here. Okay, so I'll be talking a little bit about my book, Spaces of Enslavement, and the research that I did for that. And the book as a whole focuses on 200 years of slavery in particularly Dutch New York. So I did focus on specific Dutch communities to kind of limit the research. And I looked at New York State, or what now is New York State. The communities that I focused on for the 18th century were in particular Ulster County, Albany County, and Kings County. For the 17th century, I looked mostly at New Amsterdam, so Manhattan, what today is New York City. I looked at Spaces of Enslavement, as you can see in the title, and the reason for that, or what that did was that I really focused on looking at the built environment, the architecture, geography, maps, and this kind of helped me reconstruct a different version, not really a different version, but give me a different perspective of this particular history. And when studying the history of slavery, I think it's important to take into account the spatial aspects of it because of the limited numbers of records that we have that are produced by enslaved people, which makes it very difficult to sometimes tell these histories in a more complete way or a more complex way. And looking at the spaces of enslavement, the spaces that enslaved and free New Yorkers inhabited, that they navigated, where they worshiped, looking at those spaces really helped me reconstruct that history. So what really got me to think more about spaces and spatial analysis and spatial history is my visit to Maison des Esclaves, which is on Gorée Island in Senegal, just off of the coast of Dakar. I visited here in 2010. And at that point, I had already written about slavery for quite a while. I was finishing up my dissertation, which was looking at African and Dutch cultural exchanges in early New York. When visiting this site, however, I had a very surprising response in a way that I never really had experienced when actually reading about slavery and writing about slavery, at least not in the same way. I had a very physical response to being in that space of enslavement. So this particular site that you see here, the Maison des Esclaves, is where enslaved people were held before they were transported to other parts of the Atlantic. And this was actually named after a Dutch island, Gorée Island, but eventually became a French colony. And so it was especially prominently used by the French. And when entering these spaces, like I said, I had a very physical response. I felt instantly ill, especially when entering the space where enslaved men were held, which you can see on one of these pictures. Just being in that space was as if it was palpable, some of the horrific things that happened there. I think also just seeing this space, being in that space, feeling, just the climate, the thick walls, the fact that there was only this little small area that would bring in light, that would give you some contact with the outside still. Imagining people who were held in those spaces, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks or even months, oftentimes in incredibly unsanitary and terrible conditions. It it told a story of slavery that in some ways was different from reading it on paper. And it's for this reason that when I returned to New York, returned to the US, I finished up my dissertation. And then as I was rewriting the dissertation to turn it into a book, I made a more conscious effort to actually visit spaces of enslavement in New York when rethinking really this history of slavery. And so one of those spaces was the Garrett spaces at the Lot House in Brooklyn, New York. I visited there when just a few years after I returned. And one of the things you see here on these pictures is the Garrett spaces. On the very right picture, you see the actual Garrett space. And on the center picture, you see a little stairwell that led to that. On the left, you can see here the Lot House. So right now, this part of the home was added in the early 19th century. This is the original structure built in the 1730s. And very soon, this was added, was a kitchen. And what researchers actually, nobody really realized this, but when groundskeeper, I believe it was in a closet in that kitchen, they realized that the ceiling could move and that, in fact, that could open up, and it led to this little stairwell that you see in the center here. And on each side, there's a Garrett space where they discovered evidence of actually people having resided there. And so that suggests, and there's several pieces of evidence for that the enslaved people enslaved by the Lot family lived in that space. And so by the latter part of the 18th century, we know that people enslaved by the Lot family were Mary, Hannah, Mel, Kate, Harry, Hector, Powell, as well as the children, Cyrus, Jan, Jacob, Hannah, and Paul. And so it's very likely that all of them, or many of them, lived in those two Garrett spaces. Now, these pictures were taken by a professional photographer, Chester Higgins. And so they have professional lighting and everything. But when I visited this, I took a picture with my iPhone. You could barely see. It's pitch black in there. Very, very small space. You could not stand up straight in it. There would be no natural light. Very little space for the people who live there. And so it gave me a different insight. You know, oftentimes it's said that enslaved people in New York were living in the same homes as their enslavers. Well, this is one of those places where, yes, they lived in the same structure, but they certainly did not live in the same spaces where the Lot family lived. In fact, the Lot family, these were their sleeping quarters, and this was their main living areas. I also visited churches to kind of try to reconstruct what these spaces would have looked like in the 17th and 18th century, and particularly the remaining churches, the oldest ones, are from the 18th century. So this is the Reformed Church of Shangang. I focused on the Dutch Reformed churches because I'm studying the Dutch communities, and so I focused on these Dutch churches. What this helped me do was kind of see where people might have been seated, how these churches may have been organized to separate or segregate enslaved congregants and free white congregants. How would they have navigated these churches? How did the architecture of these churches change over time? And how might the increasing presence of free and enslaved Black people have impacted some of that reorganizing of the church space? Now, I also went to the spaces that enslaved people in New Amsterdam lived and where they would have walked the streets, where they might have gone to the taverns or gone to the court. You see here a picture of the Slijksteeg, today South William Street, which was in fact where the home was of the West India Company, the people enslaved by the Dutch West India Company. You can see it on this map under number 1 right there. And We know that this was their home in the 1640s, 1650s. We don't know how many of them stayed in that home. If it was all of them, it likely was the majority of them, but not all of them. But certainly a significant number of them would have lived in that home. And on the deeds, it's actually called the home of the company slaves, it would say. And what visiting that space helped me understand is amongst others, how small actually that area was south of Wall Street, where we see the settlement of New Amsterdam. You can see on this map, this is an overlay of Manhattan in that map that I just showed you on today Manhattan. And really, if you look at this, and I visited just a few weeks ago, I was in New York City, and I walked this area again. And every time I do so, it just stands out how incredibly small this is, how small of an area it is, and how quickly you could go from one place to another. And this is, I think, very important in thinking through that particular history of New Amsterdam and the lives of the enslaved people. And so what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit more now about the various ways in which visiting those spaces and thinking about those places and spaces helped me kind of understand the history of slavery in a different way. So here's again that map that I showed you previously, and I placed some of the locations that the people enslaved by the Dutch West India Company visited during this area, frequented during this era, and some of the enslaved people enslaved by individuals as well. But during this period, during the Dutch colonial period, the majority of the enslaved people would have been enslaved by the Dutch West India Company. And so again, they lived here, number one, on what was then the Slijksteeg. There's a tavern here, right there on the corner. There's another tavern here. We see these enslaved people actually frequenting these taverns. Another one was right here. This particular tavern, we know that several enslaved people actually met there on a Sunday when it was illegal to drink. And one of them was Swan Luang, who was enslaved by Govert Lokermans, who actually had several properties here. And so it makes sense that it was, close to where he very likely would have been living. It also makes sense that they would have met here because it's farthest away from the church, which at that time was located right there, where most of the church-going residents would have been. So they would less likely be caught in actually drinking on this on the Sabbath. Other than that, though, we see that enslaved people during this period are allowed to drink. They are going to these taverns. They are exchanging goods. They also attend the church. Many of them married in the church. They baptized their children in the church. So there's one of the earlier churches was located here on Pearl Street. Later on, it was in the fort. We also see them in the courts, and actually this is where Swan Luang, when they meet for drinks, we know this from the court records. The courts by the 1650s was here, located in City Hall. And so again, if you consider the fact that these enslaved men and women, many of them would have been living here, it would have been a very short walk to go to the court. It would have been a short walk to go to any of these taverns, even this one, or the church. Really, you could be there within 5 minutes or so. And this is important, I think, because what we see in this period, during this Dutch colonial period, is that enslaved people then are actively participating within this community. They are meeting in these various locations. They're exchanging goods. They're going to the church. They are going to the court. They go to the council. They go to the court in part also to protect property or to fight for wages. So we really regularly see them there. And this has been studied by several people, but one of the things that hasn't, I think, received the attention that it deserves is the fact that the geography of this made it possible for these people to do this. First of all, they lived very closely to all of those locations. So it would have been very easy for them to go to these places. Whereas if you look at enslaved people in more rural areas, it might have been more complicated and more challenging for them to be able to go to the court or to appeal to the council. We also see that there were no restrictions on those various spaces for enslaved people. So enslaved people were not restricted from using the church. It's not that there was legislation that allowed them to access these spaces, but there was nothing that restricted them from accessing them. So there was no legislation that kept them out of the courts or that kept them out of the church or that kept them out of the taverns. And I think that this played an important role in how they were able to use that access and that close proximity to really improve their circumstances as best as they could. And so we see, if you look at the names on the bottom, those men, Paulo Angola, Groot Manuel, Klein Manuel, Manuel de Gerrit-Reus, Simon Congo, Anthony Portuguese, Gracia Angola, Peter Santomé, Jan Francisco, Klein Anthony, and Jan Fort Orange, they all were able to obtain a conditional freedom in 1644. And this was after they went to the council, which was located in the fort, and they petitioned for their freedom, which they obtained, although it was a conditional freedom. There were some really significant conditions to this, and I would be happy to talk more about that later. But they did have this some form of freedom. They obtained some lands north of New Amsterdam, and they and their wives were able to really build a community there. And I believe that this is because they were able to access those different institutions, that they were able to kind of improve their circumstances as they did in 1644. Now, this is the area. So it's in the area really around like NYU, where we see many of these people living, Greenwich Village. You can see here Bowery and Houston Street. On the corner of Bowery and Houston Street, so where you see number 23, is where Domingo and Maiken van Angola had a property. Many of those men that I just mentioned in the previous slide, they had homes here as well. And so if you go to this, this is from the Civil Rights and Social Justice map, villagepreservation.org, you can actually access this site and look up this map and other maps of the area. And it actually gives you a list of all the different locations and who had property there. Now, Domingo and Micah van Angola lived there as well then at the corner of Houston and Bowery. And they were actually not freed in 1644. Domingo Angola was able to obtain his freedom in 1659. And Micah van Angola was able to obtain her freedom in 1663. They took care of one of the children of the earlier freed people, Christina. They helped raise her after her parents passed away. They were really prominent members of this community. Also, Maiken was the witness at the baptism of Christina. That's why she ended up later on taking care of this young girl after her parents passed away. So they participated in the Dutch Reformed Church. They submitted petitions to the council. They both had been enslaved by the Dutch West India Company. They really built a life together with these other freed men and women in this area of Manhattan. Now, one of the things that is important that we see by the latter part of the 17th century is that these opportunities, these opportunities to navigate these spaces and access these spaces like churches and courts and even taverns and other public spaces became increasingly difficult for enslaved New Yorkers. And this was evident in part, you see this change slowly starting by the latter part of the 17th century. And one of the moments where I think we can see this this change is in 1671, when Domingo Angola, so this same Domingo Angola, who was living in this area, appeared in the court, was summoned to the court with Manuel Angola for entertaining and harboring enslaved and servant laborers. And the court actually determined that if they would do this again, they would be re-enslaved. And so this is one of those early moments where we see these free people actually being threatened with re-enslavement. And this is really the beginning of increasing restrictions on free and enslaved Black New Yorkers. And that continues into the 18th century. So I have here some of the legislation that we see in New York, and these are just a few snippets here and there. What is happening is that whereas in the early 17th century, there is no slave legislation, there's no slave codes, there's nothing that regulates or restricts enslaved people and their activities. Now, that changes by the latter part of the 17th century, and there's an increasing effort to really limit the movements and activities of enslaved New Yorkers. And you can see that here, for example, with that 1682 ordinance, which prohibited enslaved New Yorkers from leaving their enslavers' property without the consent. They are no longer allowed to purchase alcohol. They're no longer allowed to sell or purchase goods without permission of their enslavers. They're no longer allowed to gather with more than 3 or 4 people. They're no longer can they really navigate the streets, walk the streets without being able to show a pass of some sort or some sort of a permission from their enslaver that they're actually legitimately in that space. And this affects, of course, enslaved New Yorkers, but also free Black New Yorkers, because if you were a Black person in New York, you could at any moment be also asked to prove that you were legitimately in that space, because the assumption would be that you were more likely enslaved and that you were free if you were a Black person in New York. So there was always that burden of having to prove that you were a free person or that you were legitimately walking down the streets that you were walking. And with that, in an effort to be able to control these movements and activities of enslaved people in New York, we see that there are increasingly patrols, watchmen, and pass systems, amongst others, to enforce that legislation in public spaces. So New York City had watchmen or bellmen that would patrol the streets, and their main purpose was not to regulate the activities of enslaved people, but it was one of them. We also see patrols. There's increasing legislation. So you have these different patrols, watchmen, pass systems, all to enforce the movements and activities of enslaved people in these public spaces. So in rural areas, we see patrols that are actually used to control enslaved people and so forth, to make sure that they're not navigating the streets, doing things that they shouldn't be doing. Now, in the churches, we also see increasingly that whereas in the 17th century, enslaved people are in these churches, they are participating, they are worshiping in these churches. In the 18th century, they're increasingly kept out of the churches. And this is not a top-down decision by the Dutch Reformed Church. At least there's no evidence of that. I believe that this is more so the actual congregations that are increasingly keeping enslaved people out of these churches. And one document that kind of helped me understand this is by Reverend Peter Lowe. This is a document I found at the Brooklyn Historical Society. It's a letter that Reverend Peter Lowe, who together with Reverend Schoolmaker, they were the reverends of the 6 congregations of Kings County, so what today is Brooklyn, New York. Peter Lowe was the one who writes about this moment in 1788 when a group of Black men are requesting membership in his church. And he refuses to, he wants to accept them. He actually literally says in his letter that I thought they were worthy. But his congregants object to accepting them in the church. And I've listed here the some of the reasons that he puts in his letter, this letter to a friend. He actually lists 10 of the congregants' objections to accepting Black members in the church, and he also includes his own rebuttal to each of them. And one of these objections, as you can see, the very first one was that they would have no souls, and that was a reason not to accept them in church. I should note that in response to all of these objections, Peter Lowe actually had a rebuttal. He did not agree with any of them. So to this one, he said something along the lines of, what about, do you have a soul? If you could say such a thing. And I'm totally paraphrasing him here. He did not say it with those words, but that's what it came down to. Another objection 4, there are species, I'm quoting now, there are species that are very different from us. Witness their nauseous sweat, complexion, manners, etc. I cannot endure them near me. I would be ashamed to commune with them. This really speaks to the spatial element of that. The fact that they objected to actually sharing that church space with enslaved people, that they would not want to be in close proximity to them within that church. And mind you, these are the same people that were taking care of their children, cooking their food, cleaning their homes, working their land. But when it came to actually sharing that religious space with them, they were very resistant to that. Important here is also to keep in mind that in Kings County, so Brooklyn, New York, at the time, whereas it was about a third of the population that was enslaved in 1790, so just 2 years after this letter, in many of the townships, close to 75% of the households actually enslaved people within their homes. So most of the congregants very likely enslaved people in their homes. Now, the last objection that I have listed here, objection 8, they complained that if many of them would be admitted, and I'm quoting now, I tremble for the ark, adieu, order and harmony in the Dutch church, see the absurd consequences, Negroes will at length summon their masters before the consistory, nay, will constitute a consistory themselves. What an awful sight, Negro elders, deacons, church masters, etc. Like I said, there were 10 in total. This one really shows how they were worried of how this might affect the church. And, if they start claiming their equality within the church, then obviously that would also challenge the hierarchy of their communities. So it's very clear that this is closely connected to the fact that they were very much benefiting from this system of enslavement. Many of these congregants were. Some of the other objections were like it would be too much like the Methodist Church. There's a few other, of course, they are descendants of Ham, was another one. So a long list and all very diverse. So it even at some point feels as if they don't really know what would be a good reason not to include enslaved Black people in their church. They're just trying different things. And this keeping people segregated within the church or not wanting to share the church space with enslaved people is also evident at the First Church of Albany. There is several records there that refer to people in the church who are objecting to having enslaved people too close to their pews. And in these churches, in Albany's church, for example, and this was the case in most of these Dutch Reformed churches, when we see more Black people in these churches by the latter part of the 18th century, we see the numbers start to increase a little bit again. When they are in the church, they're usually sitting in the back seats, either on the first floor or on the second floor. So they're not usually sitting in the gallery, like they don't have these seats that you see here. They're on the back benches. And this particular picture is taken kind of from that area. So you can see that, what they would have been able to see of the minister of what's going on there is very little. And they might have been able to hear very little as well. And we don't know how enslaved New Yorkers experienced this, or at least I haven't seen any records of that. But we do have some accounts from New England, which undoubtedly are very similar to what enslaved New Yorkers would have experienced, namely that they experience this as increasingly or incredibly humiliating, being really put in some of these back areas, hardly being able to hear the sermon and so forth. Now, as you can see on the in the text on the left side of this slide, in this church, then even those Black people who were allowed to participate in the church were sitting in those back benches in that back area. Even there, we see some congregants complaining that they are too close to their pews. And so in 1815, Daniel Winner informed the Treasury that he would pay for his pew only provided, quote, the consistory will remove the Blacks from behind his pew, as was understood. And there's some other references very similar to this one, where white congregants are objecting to that close proximity of Black congregants in the church. And so in the case of Albany, they are actually placed elsewhere. What we see oftentimes with these back benches is that on the first floor, the elderly people are allowed to sit, and on the second floor, the more younger congregants are seated, usually separated by gender. And so in some of these cases, the older congregants may have been redirected to actually be seated on the second floor. Now, going back to the home and the houses and those spaces of enslavement, I showed you the lot house. The lot house, I believe, was more of a development over time and where they housed their enslaved people. Whereas I think with Schuyler Mansion, we can see a more intentional organization of the home and where enslaved people would live and work. Albany Mansion, Schuyler Mansion in Albany is, of course, the home of Philip Schuyler, who was the now more famously known as the father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. The home, you can see, this is a picture of the back of the house. This is a model of what the home looked like at the time. It was built in the 1760s when the Schuyler family already enslaved a significant number of people, just above 10 people, 13, 14, depending on the exact year. The Hudson River would have been on this side right here. There would have been an entryway like this way. And then, of course, this is where you would enter the home. Schuyler mentions this beautiful Georgian style home that was very popular amongst all Americans in this period, more elite people, elite families. So whether you're in New York or New England or Virginia, we see these types of homes everywhere. The enslaved people most likely lived in the basement or cellar of the mansion. And you can see here on the back of the home, the only entrance would have been somewhere here in the back that would go straight into that walled courtyard that you could see here. And this, of course, allows the Schuyler family to really control the movements and activities of the people they enslaved and their labor. Most of their labor would have been done within that walled courtyard, especially for the enslaved women. Of course, there would have been work done, in these areas on the land. And somebody like Lewis, one of the enslaved men, would have been who was transporting, like riding a lot of the family members to different places or visitors. Prince, the butler, he would have been mainly in the main areas of the home, these areas, but most of the enslaved people would have been working within this walled courtyard and in the cellar. And that is also very likely the area where most of them, if not all of them, lived, in that same cellar. And so it's a way to really control and contain their movements and activities. With these windows in the back of the home, that area could very easily be watched. And so the Schuyler family could always see what was going on in that area. This created a situation very similar to the panopticon, the idea that people are going to be influenced in their activities when they believe they might be watched, even if they don't know if they are watched at that very moment. And so when you visit Schuyler Mansion and you walk in through those front doors and you see this beautiful building, um, tall ceilings, lots of natural lights, that is not how the enslaved people would have experienced that space. They would very rarely be in that front area. They would have been in the back areas, in the cellar, in that walled courtyard. And so physically, it was a very different part of the home and a very different experience in that home. But importantly, of course, it also is on emotional level that these spaces had very different meanings to these people. They experienced these spaces very differently, not just because of the physical aspects, but also because of the fact that they were enslaved in those spaces. So whereas the home usually represents family, domesticity, perhaps safety, hospitality to the free white families. For enslaved people, those were spaces of enslavement, of forced labor, of family separation, of abuse, of neglect. And this becomes very evident, I think, when you look through the record and you see the abundant number of what are called the runaway slave advertisements, right? As well as the bills of sales, where we see enslaved people being purchased and sold really at any age. Children as young as 1 year old regularly are being sold to other families. And so Sojourner Truth talks about this in her narrative, and that really stood out to me how she talks about this, because I think it gives us an insight into that constant knowing that this might happen to you, in particular at certain moments. Sojourner Truth here is talking about her experiences when their enslaver passed away. And at the time, Sojourner was still called Isabella Baumfree. She was living with her mother, father, and brother. And they lived in the cellar of the home of their enslaver, the Hardenbergs. When their enslaver passed away, she narrates later on in life, she narrates finding her mother in tears regularly. And I'm just going to read this to you because I think it's important to hear it from her. And mind you, this is in third person because she's narrating it to another person who wrote it down. So after this event, an event being the death of their enslaver, she was often surprised to find her mother in tears. And when, in her simplicity, she inquired, "Mama, what makes you cry?" she would answer, "Oh, my child, I'm thinking of your brothers and sisters that have been sold away from me." And she would proceed to detail many circumstances respecting them. But Isabella long since concluded that it was the impending fate of her only remaining children, which her mother but too well understood. Even then, that called upon those memories from the past and made her crucify her heart afresh. So in this moment, Sojourner's mother knew that any moment her children could be taken away from her. And those were her last two children she still had by her side. She already had lost many others. I believe in total there were 8. She was right. Very soon after, Sojourner was sold at the auction block, as was her brother. Sojourner was 8 years old at the time. And this was not unusual. This was what happened to most families. Even if it did not happen, there was always the opportunity that it did, and always the fear that it would. But in reality, in most cases, families would be separated, especially in New York, where so few people were enslaved by the same family. We see that in many cases, families are separated. Children, husbands, wives are living in various parts of New York or beyond. And that is why we see many of these advertisements where enslaved people are running away from the homes that they're living in to be with family. They're not with their family in the houses where they live. And that's the case here with Mary who was living in Gravesend, Long Island, who's fleeing to be with her mother. Now, I just want to note that there also, of course, were ways in which enslaved people used those spaces to resist their enslavers and to resist this control over their movements and activities in public and private spaces or religious spaces. In the lot house, for example, we see that in that garret space that I showed you earlier, if you look closely, you can see here the corn cob still. They found under the floorboards that enslaved people had ritually placed corn cobs there. They also had placed an oyster shell and a goat pelvis in a cloth pouch. That is a very typical or common practice in various African societies, as well as across the African diaspora, of placing such items to protect a space or wearing it on your body to protect yourself or protect a person. The corn cobs were placed in such a way that it was either a star or a cross, both symbols that also were very prominent within the African diaspora, and also were likely used to safeguard that space. They were placed by the chimney and the doorway, which further suggests that they were used to safeguard that space. So we see how they used whatever available to them to still resist that control over the spaces in which they lived. We also see that when we look at the public spaces, they are not navigating the streets in the same way that their enslavers are expecting them to do. We see that enslaved New Yorkers are traveling from area to area via alleyways and backyards. When they're not allowed to sell goods, we actually see that they're selling them in outhouses, for example. So they're finding all these ways to navigate those spaces differently, and they develop different ways of knowing those spaces that will still allow them to participate in them, just in a way that's unseen and unnoticed. So as a final, as a final note, I just want to go to James Fenimore Cooper, because one of the things I learned from this research and really looking at spaces and the interactions within these spaces and the way in which spaces could be used to control and monitor and surveil enslaved people, but also how spaces could be used to resist slavery and enslavement. One of the things that kept coming to mind is what is also mentioned here by James Fenimore Cooper, but it's this idea that somehow in New York, slavery was more humane, less oppressive, because enslaved people lived in the same homes, worshipped in the same churches, worked alongside their enslavers, and that somehow meant that they were living, that it was a different type of slavery from what we see in other parts of the Americas. And James Fenimore Cooper talks about this in Satan's Toe, and he actually says, I'm quoting now, "New York never had slaves on the system of the Southern planters or in gangs of hundreds to labor in the fields under overseers and who lived apart in cabins of their own. But our system of slavery was strictly domestic, the Negro almost invariably living under the same roof with the master, or if his habitation was detached, as certainly sometimes happened, it was still near at hand, leaving both races as part of a common family." And that's my emphasis in that last part. This idea that somehow they're part of a common family because they lived in the same structures, or they may have worshiped in the same churches. When you look closely at those spaces and you see where enslaved people really were living, how they were treated, the experiences in those spaces, the way in which those spaces were controlled, which really were very similar to what we see in Southern plantation societies, then we see that this is absolutely a false notion of representing slavery in New York, which I think is more representative of how New York liked to see itself in the 19th century, but it's a myth that really has persisted into today. It says more about that than the actual experience of enslaved people in New York. So that is where I will end it because it's time. But I would love to hear your questions, and you can also always email me if you want to follow up on something. So thank you so much for having me.
First question is from Georgia. I think it relates to one of the first images that you showed, and They asked, are there houses with similar designs, hidden garrets to the house still standing?
That's a great question. I think a lot of areas, actually, a lot of historic homes, they're exploring this and they're trying to see if those were spaces that enslaved people were actually living. So I visited the historic Huguenot Street recently, and there they showed me some garret spaces that were not exactly like the Lot family ones, but there's definitely similarities where they believe the enslaved people may have been living, and they have some good archaeological evidence to show that as well. So there is there's definitely, we could find this in other historic homes, but I think what the problem is sometimes with this is to determine for sure that these were the living spaces. And that can be a challenge. And this is why the Lot House is so special, because they actually found that evidence, that archaeological evidence, in the same way that actually at the historic Huguenot Street, the particular home, I believe it was the Jean Hasbrook home, they also found some evidence that suggests that they were actually living in that space.
In doing family history research in the town of Bern, Albany County in the late 1790s, I noticed that the community had slaves, making up about 1% of the population of the town. It was a small rural community. What kind of living spaces would an enslaved person live in at the time in rural New York? And she also said that my ancestors were also a part of the Dutch Reformed Church, and would the enslaved participate in the church at that time period in rural New York?
So in most cases, they would have been residing in the cellars or attics or garret spaces. There's a few cases where there were outbuildings, where they actually had separate spaces, but in most cases, it would have been in those parts of the home. When it comes to participating in the church, so in most cases in New York, we see that the number of enslaved people participating in the Dutch Reformed Church is very low up until the latter part of this 18th century. And that really is with the change of the Second Great Awakening that we see that the numbers are increasing. Before that, in most churches, it would have been very few. In a few cases, they would accept enslaved people in the church. So Albany, for example, has a significant number at some point, I believe it's in the 1730s, of enslaved and indigenous people that they're accepting in the church. And just to note that enslaved people, there were also, they were not just of African descent, they were also indigenous people who were enslaved in New York. But so it depends on the church, and you can actually oftentimes find this information. So if you would know the church, you could, if the records still are there, the membership records or marriage or baptismal records, you could get some sense of that. I hope that answers the question, Linda.
Okay, and Bradford asks, can you comment on conditions in Brooklyn which had more slaves engaged in agriculture?
Yeah, so I'm not sure like what the conditions are that you're interested in, if like the living conditions or labor conditions. But many of the people, because it's agriculture, many of the people would have been working in agriculture on the farms. Then there's also, of course, in domestics, and in a place like Brooklyn, it would have been also more in commercial, like shipping and at the dock and such type of labor. When thinking about conditions more on a, living circumstances, it would have been very similar to what I showed you. So living in garret spaces, like at the Lot House, sometimes in these separate outbuildings. When you go to the Brooklyn Historical Society, the number of bills of sale for enslaved people are absolutely depressing. They are abundant. So we see a lot of enslaved people who are bought and sold within that community and beyond. A lot of also runaway advertisements from that area that suggest that a lot of people are trying to get away from where they are or try to be with family members elsewhere. So I hope that gives you some sense and answers the question a little bit, as to the condition. So very similar as elsewhere, but this was an area where the population was much larger, the enslaved population, than in most other areas. So this was really a much larger over, when we take the whole region in 1790, I believe about 15% of New York was enslaved. So if you compare that to 30% in Kings County, you can see how really there the enslaved population was a much larger part of the overall population.
Okay, and Linda asks, understanding that slavery is still slavery, was the type of work and living spaces truly different in New York versus in the South?
So what part of it what did she want me to compare with the South? Sorry.
Well, the work, and were there any differences in the work and living spaces, like urban versus rural environments?
Yeah.
Again,
So,
New York City.
yeah, I got it. Sorry. Labor, of course, was different because of the type of labor that was the main labor force in the South. When we look at enslaved people, of course, they were predominantly cultivating rice or tobacco. Later on, also cotton. Whereas in New York, it was more, smaller farm work. But when we look at urban areas, it was very similar to urban areas in New York. When it comes to living conditions, we see that was very similar. The big difference is really the type of large plantations that you see in the South, and the labor that people on those large plantations were doing. That is not something that we see in New York, or we see very rarely. I mean, Phillipsburg Manor was a larger plantation in a way, but that's unusual. So what we also see, what is very different in that, is that we also don't see large numbers of enslaved people who live on one property. In New York, people were really spread out over different families, which in many ways made it more challenging even to be close to family and friends, because you would be staying in different homes and have fewer opportunities to see each other and be with each other. So there's definitely differences in that sense. What I think is important to keep in mind is that it's very similar in that there are systems of enslavement that require violence, that require control, that require legislation to be able to keep people enslaved. If you don't have that, it will not be sustainable. And we actually see that type of legislation and those types of system that they develop in New York is very similar to places in the South, and even the ways in which they organize their homes. So if you look at a more prominent Southern family and the enslaved people who lived predominantly and worked predominantly in and around the house, so Thomas Jefferson, for example, it actually would be more similar to a Ten Brook family in Albany or a Schuyler family in New York than that it's different.
Questions, but I think we'll just have time for one. They asked, is it correct that there were more enslaved people in colonial New York than in the South?
Is this in total numbers? Is that the question?
I don't indicate.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I can answer that, because of course, the first knee-jerk reaction would be like, no, that can't be correct. But if we look at slavery in New York, we're looking at a 200-year time period. Whereas if you're looking at, I mean, the South is a large region, right? So, but if we take a specific part of that, it would have been much shorter. The Virginia would be the same as longer as New York. But if we look at a place as Georgia, we actually see that slavery existed there a little over 100 years, slavery by Europeans, of predominantly enslaved Africans. That was a little over 100 years. Whereas when we think of slavery, we think of, we tend to think of places like Georgia, whereas New York had slavery in the area for almost twice as long, right? So if you take all that into consideration, probably not, but I don't know. I haven't crunched the numbers. I wouldn't be able to give you that answer with any authority, but it's a great question. So thank you for that.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Mosterman,
Thanks so much.
for sharing your wisdom with us today, taking us a little bit into the past of colonial New York. And welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye, y'all.